In the autumn of 1887, the Parlor house at the end of Birch Hollow Road came to auction with everything still inside it. The woman who had kept it for 31 years had died without heirs the county could locate, and the territorial administrator in Laramie had grown impatient waiting for anyone to claim the property. So he packaged it as a lot. The building, the land, the furniture, whatever remained on the shelves and in the cupboards, all of it together for a single price. Most of the bidders came for the walnut settee or the iron frame bed, which were still sound. None of them came for the music box. It sat on the parlor mantelpiece, a small rosewood case with a brass cylinder inside and a crack running the full length of its lid, clean and deliberate as a knife stroke. The auctioneer pointed at it only because a woman in the back of the room had asked about it. He said the mechanism was likely sprung, that the crack suggested the box had been dropped or struck, and that in his professional estimation it was worth perhaps $3 if the buyer had more optimism than sense. The room laughed, briefly and not unkindly. The woman in the back of the room wrote the figure on a slip of paper and did not laugh. Her name was Nora Fenn. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a clockmaker from Council Bluffs who had died the previous winter of a chest ailment that came on fast and did not leave. She had his tools in a canvas roll inside the battered traveling trunk she had carried from Iowa on the night coach, and she had his particular habit of hearing things other people could not. He had told her once that a broken clock still kept its reason inside it, the same as a broken person. The mechanism remembered what it was built to do, he said. Her work was only to listen, and then to give it back. She had arrived in the settlement of Birch Hollow 3 weeks before the auction, looking for work and finding very little. The town wasn't unkind to her, but it was not large enough to need a clockmaker's daughter, and the 2 establishments that might have employed her in any clerical capacity had already filled their positions. She had taken a room at the Miller boarding house on the strength of what remained in her purse, and had spent those 3 weeks doing small repair work for the households within walking distance, mostly spring tension adjustments on pocket watches and 1 case of a mantel clock whose escapement wheel had shed a tooth. The work with the escapement wheel had taken her 4 evenings, working by oil lamp at the small table in her room, while the boarding house settled and quieted around her. She had to cut and fit a replacement tooth from a scrap of hardened brass she found in the bottom of her father's canvas roll, shaping it with a jeweler's file, and then seating it into the wheel's rim with a heat-set pin no larger than a splinter. She had done this kind of work before, under her father's eye, and she understood it to be precise in the way that most things worth doing are precise. 1 degree of angle wrong and the tooth would skip. 2 degrees and it would strip its neighbor. 3 and the wheel would lock entirely. She got it on the 3rd evening. When she wound the clock the next morning and the pendulum began its steady count, the family whose mantelpiece it occupied stood in their front room and watched it in a silence that was very close to reverence. They paid her $1.25. None of it amounted to enough. She needed a piece of work she could set her full skill to, something the town believed was ruined and that she could prove was not. The auction notice had been posted on the dry goods store, and the assay office and the door of the Miller boarding house itself for 10 days before the sale. Nora had read it carefully each time she passed. The Parlor house was described as a 2-story wood frame structure in serviceable condition, with a detached privy and a kitchen garden gone to seed. The contents were listed only as furniture, domestic goods, and sundry personal effects. Nothing in the notice told her what was on the mantelpiece. She had walked the length of Birch Hollow Road 2 days before the auction, not going inside but standing at the gate for a time and looking at the house's closed face, its curtains still in the windows and its paint still holding along the southern wall where the weather had been gentler. She had not known what she was looking for. She had known she was looking. The morning of the auction, she rose before the boarding house kitchen was lit and dressed carefully in her good wool skirt and the cream-colored blouse her mother had made her, and she pinned her shawl, the vivid red knitted shawl that had been her grandmother's, against the cold morning air, and she walked to the parlor house with her purse in her pocket and the particular composure of someone who had already decided. The music box cost her $3.40, once the auctioneer's fee was added. She carried it back to her room at the boarding house wrapped in her shawl and set it on the table near the window where the afternoon light came in, straight and clear. She did not open it that evening. She sat with it for a time listening, and then she went to bed. She had learned this from her father. You did not rush a thing you meant to understand. The crack in the lid was the first order of business, but it was not the mechanism's ailment. A cracked lid is cosmetic. It can be stabilized with hide glue and a thin strip of maple veneer if the craftsperson has patience and the right clamp. Nora had both. She set the case on its side on her work table and examined the crack under the morning light, running her fingertip along it to feel whether the two panels had begun to separate at depth or whether the fracture was shallow. It was shallow, which meant the lamination below was intact, and she would not need to work the wood apart and repress it. She mixed a small amount of hide glue from the stick she kept in her kit, warming it over the lamp until it went fluid, and she worked it into the crack with the thinnest of her father's brushes, working it in from both ends toward the center and tapping the surface as she went to encourage the glue to seat. Then she applied pressure. She had no proper clamp small enough for the case, so she improvised with a length of cord wound twice around the box's body and twisted tight with a short dowel. It was not elegant. It was adequate. She left it for the full 24 hours the glue required, resisting the impulse to check it before the cure was complete, because her father had taught her that checking too early was a way of ruining things you had already half saved. She worked that repair over 2 mornings, holding the joint under pressure while the glue cured, not rushing the set. And by the 3rd morning, the crack was stable and would not worsen. She did not fill it to invisibility. Her father had taught her that a repair you could see honestly was more truthful than a repair that pretended the damage had never happened. Then she turned to the mechanism. The music box was a cylinder type, as the auctioneer had noted, with a brass cylinder of perhaps 4 inches in diameter and 12 distinct tines in the comb, which was the part that plucked the notes. She removed the cylinder carefully, working the pivot pins loose with the finest of her father's adjusting rods, and she examined the comb under her magnifying lens. One tine was bent, not broken, only deflected perhaps 3 degrees off its axis, which was enough to silence it entirely and to cause the cylinder to catch on it with each revolution, producing the grinding halt that had caused the box to appear sprung. It wasn't sprung. It had simply been asking, in the only language available to it, for someone to listen. She worked the tine back with a brass stylus and a light touch, checking the alignment after each adjustment, holding the comb up to the window so the light passed through the tine gaps evenly. On the first attempt, she brought the tine back 2 degrees, and the gap read almost true, but the tine still sat fractionally high, which would cause it to overpluck and produce a note too sharp for its neighbors. She eased it back another half degree and checked again. Better, not right. She set the comb down and went to supper and came back afterward and looked at it again in the lamp's different light. The angle read true to her in that warmer register. She picked up the stylus a final time and applied the last correction, the smallest adjustment she had made yet, and set the comb back under the lens. True, the gap read even across all 12 tines. It took the better part of an afternoon and 2 false starts where she had gone fractionally too far in one direction and had to return. Her father had said that repair work was the only conversation in which you were required to let the other party finish speaking, before you replied. On the fourth day in her possession, she reassembled the music box. She wound the mechanism with the small brass key she had found loose in the box's felt-lined interior, turning it 8 clicks as the spring accepted tension. Then she set the cylinder at its starting notch and opened the fly governor. The box played. The melody was not one she recognized by name. It was in a minor key, deliberate and unhurried, with a particular interval between the 5th and the 6th note that gave it the feeling of something unresolved, a question the melody kept returning to without quite closing. The comb tines plucked in their proper sequence, and the repaired tine sang true, indistinguishable from its neighbors, which is the only mark of repair work done correctly. She listened to the full revolution, and then she let it play again. Somewhere in the second revolution she felt the strangeness of the tune. Not unpleasant, only precise in the way of a thing that had been made for one purpose, and no other. The melody did not feel like a dance piece, though its 3/4 count gave it the shape of a waltz. It felt more like a name someone had set to notes, because names could be taken away, and notes could not. She took it to the woman who ran the dry goods counter, a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who had lived in Birch Hollow since the early years, and who had, in Nora's estimation, committed most of the town's history to a well-organized interior catalog. Mrs. Pratt was a neat, substantial woman with hair the color of old pewter, and a manner that suggested she had formed her opinions before you arrived, and would form her opinion of you with comparable efficiency. She had shown Nora no particular warmth, but no particular coolness either, and had sold her lamp oil and writing paper and a paper of sewing needles in 3 separate transactions, without making the purchases feel like impositions. Nora set the open music box on the counter between a bolt of calico and a jar of penny candy, and wound it and let it play. She watched Mrs. Pratt's face. Mrs. Pratt listened through the full revolution with her hands resting flat on the counter, and her eyes directed at the box rather than at Nora. She did not say anything for a moment after the cylinder completed its circuit. Then she said it was a waltz. Nora said she had thought as much. Mrs. Pratt said she did not know the name of it. Something in her expression had shifted, quick as a shadow across a wall, and Nora noted it. She asked as easily as she could whether Mrs. Pratt had been inside the Parlor house at the end of Birch Hollow Road before the auction. Mrs. Pratt said she had not. She said the woman who kept that house, a woman named Clara Webb, had kept very much to herself in her later years, and that the people of the town had extended to her the courtesy of not asking questions they would not have wanted answered. She paused and added that Clara Webb had been, in her opinion, a woman of considerable dignity who had carried something heavy for a long time without setting it down, and that was all she proposed to say on the subject. Nora thanked her and rewrapped the box in her shawl and carried it back to the boarding house. That evening, she went to the Land Records office, which was a single room attached to the back of the county assessor's building, and kept by an elderly man named Thaddeus Gould, who had been recording deeds in that county since the late 1860s. The room smelled of aged paper and the particular dry mineral quality of old ink, and its shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, each section labeled in Thaddeus Gould's precise hand with the year range of the records it contained. He was at his desk when she arrived, a spare man of perhaps 70 with a neat white beard and spectacles that he wore near the end of his nose, and he looked up at her arrival without surprise, as though people came at this hour regularly, though she suspected they did not. She told him she had purchased the music box from the auction at the Parlor house, and that she was attempting to learn its provenance, meaning she wanted to know who had owned the house before Clara Webb and how Miss Webb had come to have it. Thaddeus Gould looked at her over his spectacles for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Then he went to his shelves, The property record for the house at the end of Birch Hollow Road ran back to 1852, when the settlement was still new enough that the deeds were written in pencil on paper that had since gone brown at the edges. The house had been built by a man named Emmett Rain, a furniture maker who had come up from Kansas with his wife, Dorothea, and an unmarried sister, and who had established a modest cabinetry business in the first years of the town. He had been known in the county as a careful craftsman who worked in walnut and cherry, and who took commissions from as far as 30 miles off. The Parlor house mantelpiece, Thaddeus Gould mentioned, had been Emmett Rain's own work, and it was still considered the finest piece of interior carpentry in the settlement. In 1856, according to the record, Emmett Rain had transferred the deed to the property to one Gideon Soar, a land speculator who had passed through the county during a period of rapid acquisition, for a sum of $22. Thaddeus Gould paused there. He said that was a low figure for that property in that year, and that the parcel had been worth closer to $110 by any reasonable measure. Nora asked him how the transfer had been recorded, whether there was a witnessed signature. He showed her the page. There was a signature on the line marked Emmett Rain. Thaddeus Gould said quietly that in his personal opinion, he had never seen the handwriting he associated with Emmett Rain produce a capital E with that particular descender loop, but that a personal opinion wasn't a legal finding. He said this in a tone that was precise and neutral, the tone of a man who has kept accurate records for 20 years and understood the difference between what a record said and what it meant. Nora wrote the name Gideon Soar in her notebook. She also wrote the name Dorothea Rain. She asked whether there was any record of what had become of the Rain family after the property transfer. Thaddeus Gould went back to his shelves, pulling two ledgers and setting them side by side on his work surface, and running his finger along the columns with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knows his own system well. Emmett Rain had died in the county of a fever in 1858, and his death was recorded. His wife, Dorothea, had no further record in the county after 1856, the same year as the property transfer. The sister had no record at all after the family's arrival, which was itself noted only because Emmett Rain's cabinetry tools had been inventoried as part of a brief estate matter in 1858. The tools had been sold at that time for $11.60. The record noted the buyer's name as Gideon Soar. Nora set her pen down. She picked it back up and continued writing. She asked whether there were any Rain descendants in the county, or anyone of that name who had come back. Thaddeus Gould looked at her again over his spectacles. He said there was a woman, older now, who lived on the road south of town. Her name was May Tutt, but her mother had been a Rain before her marriage. He said May Tutt was particular about who came calling, that she had lived alone since her husband died 11 years back, and that she did not welcome people who arrived asking for favors. He said this with no unkindness, only as a practical piece of information that would save both of them time. Nora thanked him. She asked if he would be willing to prepare a notarized transcript of the 1856 deed record, if it came to that. He said he would, provided there was a lawful basis for the request. She said she expected there would be. He nodded once in the way of a man who has seen enough of the world to know when the basis for something is already in the room, even if the paperwork has not arrived yet. She went back to her room and sat with the music box in the lamplight. She played it twice through, watching the cylinder turn. The question in the melody kept resolving back to its beginning, circling, always landing on the same unfinished interval. She thought about the crack in the lid, which she had already established was stable. She thought about the crack as something deliberate rather than accidental. She looked at the lid in the lamplight and for the first time ran her thumb along the interior edge of the crack rather than its face. There was a lip there, a very slight one, barely the width of her thumbnail. She went to her father's canvas roll and took out the thinnest of his parting tools, a flat-ground steel blade no wider than a match. She held it over the lamp a moment, not heating it enough to compromise the temper, but only warming it so the steel would move through the wood's grain with less resistance. Then she worked it into the crack from the interior side, applying almost no pressure at all, only finding the gap and following it. The lid was thicker than she had estimated, and she understood why. The lid was 2 layers. Between them, pressed flat by the lamination of 2 panels of rosewood and preserved from light and air for however many years, was a folded piece of paper. She worked it free with the parting tool in her fingers, careful not to tear it along the fold lines, turning the tool's angle each time she felt resistance rather than forcing through. It took longer than she expected. She did not rush it. When the paper came loose at last, she set the tool down and sat with the folded sheet in her open hands for a moment before she opened it, because she had already understood enough about what she was holding. She carried it to the lamp. It was a letter, written in a woman's hand, in pencil that had kept its legibility against all probability. The salutation was a name, Dorothea. "If you find this," it began, "it means you were not here when it happened." Nora sat back in her chair. She read the letter slowly, 3 times in full, to be certain she was not misreading the script in the lamp's yellow light. The letter had been written by Clara Webb, who identified herself not as the Parlor house's keeper, but as its former servant, hired by the Rains in 1853, and present in the house at the time of the deed transfer in 1856. She wrote that Gideon Sorey had come to the house with 2 other men on an afternoon in September when Emmett Rain had been in town at the lumber yard, and that he had presented a document to the sister, whose name was Frances, insisting it required Emmett's mark by end of day, or the property would be attached for a debt Sorey claimed Emmett had owed him. Frances, who could not read, had provided what Sorey asked for. Clara Webb had been in the kitchen. She had seen the men leave. She had seen the document in Sorey's hand as he passed the door. She had not known what to do. She had written this letter that same evening and hidden it in the lid of the music box, which had been a wedding gift to Dorothea Rain from her mother, and which sat on the parlor mantel where Clara was confident no transaction would take it. She had intended to give it to Dorothea when she returned. Dorothea had not returned. No one had come. Clara Webb had remained in the house as its new tenant under Sorey's arrangement, and then as its keeper when Sorey moved on to other counties, and she had tended the box on the mantel for 31 years, waiting for someone who did not come, and she had eventually concluded that if she could not deliver the letter herself, she would leave the box where it could be found, and she would trust the finding to whatever came after her. She had signed it, Clara M. Webb, October 1856. At the bottom of the letter, in slightly different pencil, added later in a hand that showed the deliberateness of age or of great care, were 2 lines. "The melody the box plays is called Dorothea's Waltz. Emmett made the cylinder himself. He was a fine maker of things." Nora held the paper until her hands were steady. Then she set it flat on the table and placed her father's magnifying lens over it to preserve it from her breath. And she did not touch it again that night. She sat for a long while in the lamplight with the music box open beside the letter and the sound of the boarding house settling in the cold. Have you ever held a thing that kept faith for 31 years while no one was watching? That is what that letter was. If you know that feeling, leave a word for it. Some things deserve to be named. She went to May Tutt's house the next morning, walking the south road with the music box in her arms and the letter folded carefully inside the case against the felt lining. The road was dry and cold, and the sky above the ridge was the pale gray of November. with the kind of light that makes distances look shorter than they are. The house was set back from the road behind a board fence that had been mended recently, the new boards showing lighter than the old, and the kitchen garden to the south side showed the cleared and banked preparations of a person who planned to be there next spring. Nora stood at the gate for a moment after she arrived, setting the music box more firmly under her arm, and then she went to the door. May Tutt answered after a long pause and regarded Nora without warmth. She was a stout woman of perhaps 60, with gray hair wound close to her head, and hands that showed the particular density that comes from a lifetime of work that does not stop. Her expression was not hostile. It was the expression of a person who had answered the door too many times to enthusiasm that wanted something from her. Nora said she had purchased a music box from the auction at the Parlor house, and that she had found something inside it that she believed belonged to May Tutt's family. May Tutt looked at the box. She looked at Nora. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said to come in. The kitchen was neat and warm, with a fire in the iron stove and a pot on the back burner that smelled of dried beans and bay. May Tutt did not offer tea. She stood on the far side of the table and waited with her arms at her sides. Nora set the music box on the kitchen table and opened it and played it through one full revolution without speaking. She watched May Tutt's face the way she had watched Mrs. Pratt's, but this time the expression that moved across the older woman's features was not a shadow of recognition. It was something heavier than that, something that had been held in reserve for a long time and had not expected to be called forward. May Tutt sat down. She said, after a silence that neither of them rushed to fill, that her mother had sometimes hummed a tune like that when she was washing. She said the sound of it had come back to her sometimes over the years, and she had not known where it belonged. She said she had never known the name of it. Nora told her its name. May Tutt looked at her then, directly for the first time. Nora took the letter from the box and placed it on the table in front of May Tutt, and stepped back and let her read it. She did not watch. She looked at the kitchen window and the pale October light coming through it, and listened to the sound of the cylinder's governor ticking faintly inside the open case. Outside the window, the fence boards showed their two shades of wood, new and old, and a single crow moved across the pale sky toward the ridge. May Tutt read for a long time. When she set the letter down, she did not speak immediately. Nora waited. The clock on May Tutt's wall marked the time in its indifferent way, and a log settled in the stove with a soft concussion, and outside the road was empty in the morning light. May Tutt said that her mother had moved to her aunt's homestead in Nebraska in the fall of 1856 and had never spoken of why she left Birch Hollow. She said she had always understood it as grief after the property was lost, that her father's debt had been called in and the house sold, and there was nothing to be done. She said Dorothea Rain had not been a woman who spoke of injury, that she had instead put the injury behind her and got on with what remained, which in her estimation was the right thing to do, even when it was not the only thing. She said her mother had mentioned Clara Webb once, only once, in a letter when May was a grown woman, saying that Clara was a good woman who had stayed on in the house and who May hoped was well. She looked at the letter on the table. She said she supposed she had been wrong about the debt. Nora said there were legal instruments available, that a fraudulent deed transfer was a matter of record, and that the record existed, that Thaddeus Gould at the land office had already noted the irregularity in the signature and had agreed to prepare a notarized transcript of the deed record. She said she could not promise what any territorial court would determine after 31 years, but that a sworn statement from May Tutt, combined with the letter and the land office record, and Clara Webb's own testimony in writing, constituted a claim that ought to be put before someone who could act on it. She said it carefully, not making it sound simple, because it was not simple. May Tutt said she was 61 years old and had no use for a parlor house. Nora said that was not the point. May Tutt looked at her for a moment. Then she said she supposed it was not. She sat with her hands flat on the table on either side of the letter and looked at it, and then at the music box, which was still open on the table's corner with the cylinder visible inside it, the 12 tines of the comb catching the kitchen light. She asked how Nora had known to look inside the lid. Nora said she had not known. She had run her thumb along the interior edge and felt something that should not have been there, and she had followed it. May Tutt was quiet for a moment. Then she said that sounded like how her mother described the way Emmett Rain had worked, that he would feel along a piece of wood until it told him what was in it, and that he said the good grain was always there. You only had to find where it wanted to run. She said this without sentimentality, only as a piece of information she had been carrying for a long time that had now apparently found a place to rest. The claim went to the territorial administrator in Laramie before the end of that month, carried by Nora in a leather folder with the letter, a transcript of the land record Thaddeus Gould had prepared and notarized over 2 careful afternoons, and a signed statement from May Tutt attesting to her relationship to Dorothea Rain and to the contents of the letter as she understood them. The folder also contained a brief description written by Nora in her plainest hand of the music box's construction, the location of the hidden compartment in the lid, and the condition in which she had found the letter, which she had examined with care before removing it and had preserved without alteration. She noted the date, the paper quality, the pencil medium, and the fact that the second edition at the letter's close was in a noticeably different pressure and angle, consistent with a later hand, which she estimated at 10 to 20 years after the main composition. She did not offer an opinion on what this meant. She stated what she had observed. She had learned this from her father as well. You report what the mechanism shows you. You do not argue for it. The administrator was a methodical man named Harlan Vess, who had held the position for 4 years and who had seen enough fraudulent transfers in the county records that he had developed a particular stillness when one was presented to him, a stillness that was not indifference, but its opposite. He took the documents with that expression and said he would need 6 to 8 weeks to review the record before he could advise May Tutt on next steps. He said this as though 6 to 8 weeks were a brief interval, which in Nora's understanding of how official processes moved, it likely was. The matter took 4 months. During that time, Nora remained in Birch Hollow, having found enough small work to keep her at the boarding house through the winter. She repaired 4 pocket watches, a bracket clock with a worn mainspring, a chiming mantelpiece whose strike train had gone out of synchrony with its time train, and a music box belonging to the minister's wife that had a simpler fault than her own had presented, a jammed winding arbor that cleared in 20 minutes. She visited May Tutt twice more, once to bring a copy of the administrator's acknowledgment letter, which had arrived in January, and once simply because May Tutt had sent her a note asking whether she would like supper. She brought the music box the second time and wound it on May Tutt's kitchen table after the meal, and they listened to it together without speaking, the way you listen to something that has already said the essential thing and doesn't need to say it again. She left the box on May Tutt's mantelpiece when she went home that evening. It felt correct to her in a way she did not try to articulate, the way a well-seated joint feels correct before the glue cures, a rightness you trust because it is structural rather than decorative. Gideon Sorey had died in Colorado in 1874, which simplified certain aspects of the proceeding and complicated others. He had no estate of consequence, but the fraudulent deed transfer, now established by the administrator's finding in March of 1888, meant that the property at the end of Birch Hollow Road had never been legitimately alienated from the Rain estate. The administrator's ruling found that the property and its assessed value belonged to Dorothea Rain's heirs, of whom May Tutt was the sole surviving representative. The ruling also noted that Gideon Sora had been recorded in 2 other county deed registers during the same period under circumstances that warranted separate inquiry, and that the administrator intended to forward the relevant documentation to Laramie for that purpose. Nora read this line twice and then set the letter down and thought about all the properties that had been signed away to Soray in those years, and all the families who had not had a music box. Matt Tutt did not attend the proceeding. Thaddeus Gould sent her the paperwork by post, and she signed what needed signing and returned it. She did not sell the Parlor house immediately. She sat with the decision the way Nora's father had taught Nora to sit with a mechanism before opening it, letting the weight of the thing tell her which way it wanted to go. In the end, she arranged a sale to a family from Denver who wanted to operate it as a legitimate boarding establishment, and she placed the proceeds in a bank account in her own name at the county branch in Laramie. She wrote to Nora to tell her the amount. It wasn't a large sum. It was a correct one. Nora was present the morning the keys changed hands, standing in the parlor doorway with her coat buttoned against the October cold. The parlor mantelpiece was still there. The fine walnut carving Emmett Rain had set in place 35 years before, the grain running true and the corners still sharp where the house's years had not softened them. The new owners were a practical couple who had already measured the windows for new curtains and who showed no particular interest in the history of the walls. That seemed to her neither wrong nor right. Buildings accumulate lives the way good wood accumulates rings, and not every family needs to count them. She had moved on from Birch Hollow by then, or was nearly moved on. There was work in Cheyenne that had been offered to her the previous autumn. A watchmaker's establishment whose proprietor had written after Mrs. Pratt mentioned Nora's name to a cousin who had mentioned it in turn to the proprietor's wife, and the work was genuine and would keep her through the seasons ahead. She had accepted it by post in November and had delayed her departure through the winter while the administrator's process worked its way to a conclusion. And now that the conclusion had arrived, she had no reason to stay longer in Birch Hollow that was separate from not wanting to leave. She had not expected to feel that. She felt it anyway. She supposed that was the nature of places that had asked something of you and let you deliver it. On her last evening in Birch Hollow, she went to May Tutt's house for supper. They ate without much talk, which suited them both. May Tutt had made a venison stew with dried apples and a pan of cornbread that she set on the table without ceremony and did not offer an opinion on. Nora ate 2 bowls of the stew and all of her cornbread, and a portion of May Tutt's, which the older woman pushed toward her without comment. Afterward, May Tutt poured 2 cups of strong coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the way of people who have said the important things and do not need to say them again. The music box was on the mantelpiece above the small fire, its lid closed and the crack along it still visible, a clean seam that would not worsen. The clock on the wall marked the late hour. May Tutt asked whether Nora had known what she was looking for when she bought the box. Nora said she had not known what she was looking for. She had known something was there. May Tutt said that was her mother's way, too. She said Dorothea Rain had walked into a room and known where the thing that needed doing was without being told. She said it was a quality she had always admired and rarely seen. She said this in the tone she used for most things, which was the tone of a person reporting an accurate fact about the world, without ornamentation or apology. They sat with that for a while. When Nora rose to leave, May Tutt walked her to the door and handed her the canvas roll with her father's tools, which Nora had set on a chair when she arrived and nearly forgotten. She stood in the doorway and looked out at the road in the cold night, dark between the fence posts, the sky overhead very clear and the stars extremely numerous. the way they are in high autumn at altitude when the air has given up its moisture and become only itself. Cold and lucid and indifferent to the smallness of everything below. May Tut said from behind her that the melody had a name she could remember now. Nora said she was glad of it. She pulled her shawl close and walked down the road to the boarding house to collect her trunk for the morning stage. The music box remained on May Tut's mantelpiece through the winter and the spring that followed it. May Tut wound it on Sunday mornings with the small brass key, 8 clicks, and let it play through twice while the coffee came to heat on the stove. The melody was still in a minor key, still unhurried, still asking its interval question between the 5th note and the 6th. The repaired tine sang indistinguishably from its neighbors. The crack in the lid was stable and would not worsen. Someone who examined it later might notice the repair, or might not, depending on how closely they cared to look and what they understood about the patience required to do a thing correctly. The hidden compartment in the lid was empty now, of course. May Tut had placed the letter in a cedar box on her bedroom shelf, alongside her mother's few remaining papers, a marriage certificate from the Kansas period, and 2 letters Dorothea had kept from a sister who had gone to Oregon. The letter from Clara Webb was the longest document in that cedar box, and the most recent, and the only one that had been written in a music box lid for 31 years by a woman who had trusted that someone would eventually find it. May Tut read it sometimes, not often. She had read it enough that she did not need to read it often. There is a kind of work that appears modest to those who do not know it, and appears necessary to those who do. Nora Fenn carried her father's tools from Council Bluffs to Iowa, and from Iowa to Wyoming, and in time to places beyond that, and she used them with precision and care, and the things she worked on played their notes again, and kept their time again, and did the particular small duties they had been made to do. She never said she had uncovered anything remarkable. She said she had listened until the mechanism told her what it needed. The rest, she said, was only a matter of giving it back. What that waltz held in its cylinder, in the specific arrangement of pins and tines that Emmett Rain had set by hand in a cabinet-maker's shop in Birch Hollow more than 30 years before, was a woman's name and a craftsman's devotion and a servant's long faith and 31 years of silence on a parlor mantel. It played all of it, every revolution, to whoever was patient enough to wind the key and stay. If you have ever held a thing the world decided was worthless and found it was not, you know what Nora found that evening by the lamp. Leave a word for it below. The name for that kind of attention matters. There is another story of a woman and a thing no one would open if you want to stay close. The mechanism is different. The patience is the same.